Now, today we are jumping into part 2 of this series, How Not to Be Your Own Worst Enemy. And I want to start by getting you to think about this. Have you noticed how often you have conversations with yourself? You do this all the time. So do I. Have you noticed how often you have conversations with yourself? And that's normal. You shouldn't be alarmed by that. Now, if you're having conversations with yourself and you don't realize it's you having the conversation with yourself, maybe you should be alarmed, and that's above my pay grade. But for the rest of us, I can talk to us and help us a little bit today, because we all have conversations with ourselves, and they go beyond the mundane things. I mean, they're the things that we talk about, the simple stuff. We tell ourselves, don't forget that, and remember to, and check in on them. You know, we got all that stuff we do. It's kind of a mental checklist. But I'm talking about beyond that. There's some deeper, more impactful conversations that we have with ourselves all the time. And you've never thought about this, and you shouldn't have thought about this, but now maybe you'll be aware, because most of the big, important, impactful conversations you have with yourself are centered around the question, why? You're always asking yourself this question, so am I, why? We're always looking for an explanation for why things happened. Why didn't he text me back? And then you start having a conversation with yourself trying to figure that out, and you put together an answer to this question, don't you? You've done this. Well, why didn't she say anything to me when she saw me? And you start trying to figure that out, and you put together an answer. You fill the gap. You figure out the solution or the explanation to the question why. Why didn't they invite me to? Or why didn't they ask me to be a part of that at work, and they've got them working on the project, but then ask me, wonder why? And then we start trying to figure it out. What we do, and this is not a term that we use every day, okay, but what we do, whenever we experience something in life that we don't, have a clear answer to, whenever we experience something that creates a little confusion or uncertainty, we ask the question why, and then we create what's called a narrative. Now, narrative is just a fancy term for a story or an explanation for why something happened. And we all do this. We do it all the time. I don't know why that happened. I'm trying to make sense of why they said that. I'm trying to make sense of why they didn't do that. So we create a story or an explanation. We create a narrative, if you will, for that. Now, the reason this is important to understand is because we create and often live by our own self-created narratives. Let me say that again. We will create, and then we will often live by our own self-created narratives. In other words, okay, I don't know that they talked to me, and the reason I don't think they talked to me is because, and we put together something, and then here's why this is so important to understand. Because after we've created a narrative or an explanation for why they didn't talk to me, then we start treating them based on the explanation that we created in our head that we assume is true, but it may or may not be true. Now, this ought to scare you a little bit, okay? Because, again, I do this too. We all do it. We will come up with an explanation for something. We will assume it's true even though we haven't verified it's true. And then we will make decisions and live and treat others, treat ourselves, treat God, whoever it is, based on these narratives. You have done this, haven't you? You have treated somebody differently because you saw them over here and they didn't speak to you, and you came up with an explanation for why you thought that was, and so next time you saw them, you treated them differently. And you never actually verified that was the reason they didn't say anything. You just assumed, and again, we all do this. We have a tendency to live by our own self-created narratives, even if those narratives are not true. We do it all the time. As a matter of fact, I could pretty much guarantee you, I'm the same way, I could guarantee you that you are living by some false explanation or narrative right now in some area of your life or in some relationship. This is going on. It may even be in how you view or treat yourself. But you've created a narrative as to why you do certain things or don't do certain things, or as a narrative as to, how you're worth it or you're not worth it, or whatever the case may be. But you've got some narrative you're living by, and it's probably not even true. But you're making decisions and behaviors and interacting with people based off of that. And that is how, whenever you live by self-created narratives that are not true, that is how you end up becoming your own worst enemy. As I said last week, we all have the capacity to do this because you have participated in all your bad decisions. So have I. It's true for all of us. And as you know, a single bad decision is always the first step toward becoming your own worst enemy. Every journey starts with the first step. Every habit starts with the first time. Every pattern starts with a first line. So what I said last week was this, that if you don't want to repeat the past, if you don't want to be your own worst enemy in the future, then you and I have to learn to develop some preemptive habits. A preemptive habit is just a habit that you develop before there's a problem, so a problem does not develop. It prevents a problem. And there's some preemptive habits that you and I need to develop whenever we become aware of what I call internal cues. Internal cues. Last week, I said the habit was this, that we should learn to pay attention to our fears. Fear is a cue. Whenever you experience fear, it's a cue. Wait a minute. I need to pay attention to that fear and what it's driving me to do. Now, fear shows up for all of us, and some of us don't like to admit it, but the reality is we all deal with fear because whenever you face any circumstance or situation where there's an element of unknown, uncertain, or unexpected, then that's going to generate fear in you. It generates fear in all of us. And if you run from it, if you hide it, if you ignore it, if you try to avoid it, what ends up happening is, again, you don't realize you're doing this, and I don't either, but we are giving fear the steering wheel, is what we're doing. And when you let fear drive your life, it will drive you in a ditch, off a cliff, into head-on traffic. It's going to create some damage. You never make great decisions when they're driven by fear. Fear always creates some damage. So we talked about how do you pay attention to fears. Today I want to talk to you about the second habit, and that's this. You should pay attention to your narratives. In other words, you should pay attention to the stories or the explanations that you find yourself telling yourself in your head as to why certain things are true about you, about others, about God, about your circumstances or situations in life. Now, this can be a little confusing to wrap your head around because we create narratives in our head all the time, and it's so normal that we never think anything about it. We just assume, one, that's natural, and two, we assume that that they're all true. As a matter of fact, the more uncertainty, the more confusion, the more randomness there is that you're experiencing, the more apt you are to want to create a narrative for it because we always want to bring some reason to randomness. So we tend not to pay attention to this. So let me see if I can alleviate a little confusion by just giving you some examples of what narratives, stories, explanations look like that we tend to tell ourselves. And I'm just going to rattle through these pretty quick. Whenever you find yourself going, well, I deserve better. You've done this, haven't you? Something happened, I deserve better. Okay, might be true, might not be true, but that narrative should cause you to pause and pay attention to it. Well, I'm entitled to. Well, I should be further along. I'm not happy, or I deserve to be happy. Okay, well, that could be true, but you should pause and go, wait a minute, why am I saying this? Am I saying this based on fact? Am I saying this based on, I'm seeing this situation clearly? We have all done this. Well, he should be. I'll tell you, if he would just, then he should be. Well, if she loved me, then, they don't care. How many times have you been in a situation and you've said to yourself, well, they don't care, that's why they did that. They don't care, that's why they didn't show up. Well, maybe it's true, but maybe it's not true. But you're going to treat them differently based on this narrative that they don't care. Well, it doesn't matter. I'll just go ahead and do that. It doesn't matter. It won't make a difference. It won't make a difference if I do it. It won't make a difference if I don't. I don't do exercise. This one always makes me chuckle. I don't do exercise. I always laugh when I hear somebody say this because the doctor has told them you have to exercise, and their first thought is, oh, I don't do exercise. Well, who labeled you a don't do exerciser? Well, I did. I have self-labeled myself. I don't do exercise. Well, that's not true. You've just decided not to do exercise. But anyway, that's beside the point. I can't. See, when you hear a kid say this, you go, no. You can't tell yourself you can't. You got to try it. But then we as adults go, well, I can't do that, and we don't even try it. Go on. I'm better than that. I'm better than them. Well, they don't deserve. Well, if they would just try harder, I tell you what, I don't want to help them anymore. I tell you what, they're getting exactly what they deserve because if they just try harder, they'd figure it out. You're going to treat people differently if that's what you're saying. I can't resist. I know I need to stop. I just can't resist. Something's wrong with me. I can't fix it. I can't change. Well, I can't live without. This is my last chance, so might as well. This is my last chance. This is great, especially this time of year. Republicans are all and Democrats are just. You just pick whatever side you're on and you talk about the other side, right? It's because, again, we just lump them all together. Well, they're all that way. They're all that way. Democrats are all just. Republicans are just all. Here's some more. Men, ladies, this was all probably true. Okay, I get it. These are narratives that are probably true. Nonetheless, you should pay attention. Men, they just always. Well, every woman is like that. What do you mean by that? Sweet, kind, patient. Probably not what's going through the guy's mind. Here's some more. We'll get off those quick. If my dad had only, this is the way I am, because if my dad had only, if my mom hadn't, what about these? Southerners, Northerners. You hear this around here all the time. Southerners, they're all those Southerners. They just, all those Northerners. I wish they'd go back up north. All those Northerners. You hear people say that, don't you? What about this? Baptist, Catholics. You just pick whatever, denomination. But, they're all that way. How about these? Immigrants, foreigners, all those foreigners. Now, just real quick, I'll move on. I grew up in Hickman County as a little kid, and then we moved to Murray. But when I was young, real young, I was in Hickman County. And if you're not from around here, you don't know where Hickman County is. Even if you are around here, you haven't been in Hickman County unless you got really lost. So nobody drives through Hickman County unless they live there. But I grew up there, and I loved it. I love all the people that are there. This is not being critical. But the mentality in Hickman County when I grew up, Carlisle County was right next to Hickman County. And I'm not making this up. When people from Carlisle County would move into Hickman County, people from Hickman County would say, what are those foreigners doing moving into our county? I mean, that's how bad it was. Some of you can relate. So this isn't always a nationality. Sometimes it's next county over, those foreigners over there, But we all have a tendency to create these narratives. Now, the reason I brought this up is because whatever narratives you have in your head that you live by, you didn't just create them in a vacuum. You didn't just come up with them on your own. You're not entirely responsible for the formation of them because they were shaped and they were formed partly by who raised you, how you were raised, who lived around you when you were growing up, where you lived, the experiences you had growing up. I mean, you take all of that together. Isn't that true? You take all of that together, and it's formed some of the narratives that you believe today. And some of you know this because you moved at some point in your life to an entirely different, subset of people, if you will, in a different community. And all of a sudden you realize all these narratives that I've had my whole life, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's true because now I'm over here and I'm seeing it from a different perspective. And some of your narratives have changed. Some of your narratives, though, have never changed. You've never challenged them. You've never even thought through them. You just assume they are all true. Now, why am I spending so much time talking about this? This is a point I don't want you to miss. Narratives, especially false narratives, but narratives can be extremely dangerous because narratives create excuses. They create excuses. In other words, the narratives you tell yourself allow you to justify behaviors in you that you would never justify if someone else did it. Your narratives allow you to condone some things that you think and do that you would never condone if somebody else thought, did, or said them. Your narratives allow you to excuse yourself from making apologies for certain things, even though you would expect and demand somebody else who did what you did to make an apology. Narratives justify our pride. Narratives justify our prejudice. Narratives justify our racism, our sexism. Narratives can excuse and justify the way you talk to yourself. Now think about this for a minute. For some of you, this is so true. Narratives are what you have used to excuse the way you talk to yourself about yourself. If you heard somebody else saying to or about someone you love the things that you say about you, you'd be so furious. In other words, if somebody else used the very same words you used to describe you, to describe somebody you care about, you would jump in and defend them. You'd be so hot. But then you talk to yourself that way. You wouldn't let anybody else talk to a friend or family member that way, but you talk to yourself that way. Why? Because there's a narrative in your head. Well, I'm not worth, or I deserve, or well, it's all my fault because. You created some kind of narrative. Well, I don't think I deserve to be respected. Whatever it is, you create a narrative that excuses you treating yourself and allowing other people to treat you the way that they do. This is why narratives are dangerous. They create excuses, which lead to us being our own worst enemy. Now, here's what's fascinating to me. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul writes about this very thing. It is so fascinating because human nature in some ways has not changed at all, has it? So 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul's writing about this ability we have and this, in some cases, you might call danger that we hold of creating narratives for ourselves. And it was so personal to him. And the reason it was personal is because Paul grew up with a certain narrative in his head. Paul was a Pharisee. He practiced Judaism. He was a devout defender of Judaism. And he had a narrative in his head. And his narrative was all of those people who are followers of Jesus now, all those people who are, well, they didn't call them Christians then, they just called them followers of the way. All those people who are part of this movement, they are enemies of Judaism. Paul's narrative in his head was one, those people are trying to put an end to Judaism. They're trying to shut it down. They're trying to close the doors and do something entirely new. And Paul was right about that. That was true. But the other part of his narrative was this. Paul's narrative was also, in order to please God and honor God, the best thing I can do for God is to put an end to that movement. And so he imprisoned Christians. In some cases, he persecuted and had killed Christians. And he did it all thinking, imagine this, he did it all thinking he was doing the will of God. He did it all thinking he was doing God a favor. And so he hated Christians until he met Jesus one day, and he became one. And the minute he became a follower of Jesus, his narrative flipped, and he realized, oh my goodness, I was so certain, I believed this so deeply, and look at all the damage I did with this false narrative. And so his narrative started to change, and then Paul, as you may know, Paul spent the rest of his life traveling all around the Mediterranean rim, going town to town, city to city, trying to introduce to people this new narrative that he had experienced, and trying to help people understand the message of Jesus' death and resurrection. And as he showed up, you think your job is hard, imagine this. As he showed up, he would talk to two groups of people. He would go and he would talk to the Jewish people first, people like him. He would talk to them in the temples or the synagogues. These were people who practiced and held tightly and deeply to Judaism. And he would show up, and they knew or had heard of him because he was a Pharisee, and he would say, hey, guess what? There's a new narrative, there's a new story, there's a new explanation. God has done something new in the world. And he would tell them about Jesus, and you can close the book on Judaism. You know, there's something brand new. And they would throw him out of the synagogues. In some cases, they would try to stone him. They would beat him. They would toss him out of the city. I mean, because again, changing your narrative is so difficult to do. And then Paul would leave the Jewish people, and he would go to what they called Gentile people, non-Jewish people. In those days, they called them pagans because they practiced pagan religion. That was just a common term. So he'd go to these people, and if you knew much about pagan religion, they believed in multiple gods. And these multiple gods didn't really care what you did, and they didn't really value human beings. So these people in pagan religion, they practiced all sorts of things. They had all kinds of narratives. And he would begin to go in and try to tell them, you should change your ways. There's a new narrative, a better narrative. And again, many of them would laugh at him. But some of them would believe. Same with the Jews. A few would believe. And so Paul in all these towns, he would start church after church after church. But even after these people were Christians, they were still struggling to replace the false narratives, the false stories and explanations they were living their life by with the truth. And so Paul would write back to them over and over and over again, trying to help them learn to think and believe differently. I want to give you one example. Paul did this in the city of Corinth. He did it everywhere, but the city of Corinth is a great example. Now, if you don't know much about Corinth in the first century, it would make Vegas today look like the Vatican. That's how bad Corinth was. It was, you think, oh, things have never been worse than today. Now, read some history. Corinth was awful. It was terrible. And in Corinth, there were some things that everybody in Corinth believed. And when Paul showed up and people began to follow Jesus, these were some of the things that they believed that Paul had to start going, no, that's not true. You should change that. I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot. In Corinth, they believed that people are property. This was true all through the Roman Empire. They believed people are property. So because of that, if you could gain authority or control over somebody, then you could treat them like property. You could treat them any way you want to treat them. It didn't matter. And we hear that and think, oh my gosh, that's reprehensible. They just believed it was true. They just believed it was fact. This is why, by the way, that women were treated so poorly in the first century, because men believed they were property. Even their wives, they believed they were property. So this was not uncommon. If a man decided that he saw somebody he thought was better looking than his wife and he wanted her for a wife, he would just kick his old wife out and take a new wife. You say, well, there are divorces that happen today. Yeah, but it's different today. Today the woman has rights and the woman can, get half of the things or however that all works out. Back in those days, she had no rights. She was property. We can't even wrap our heads around this. There was not a more vulnerable position for a woman than to be kicked out of a man's house where she had no support, no resources. Back in those days, it was hard for them to get a job and make a living. And they were left to fend for themselves. This is how it worked. Again, because it's just property. This is why slavery was so rampant. They just viewed people as property. Which also meant, by the way, you could be over people and treat people like property one day, but if somebody gained power over you or leverage over you, suddenly you're property the next day. They also believe might makes right. In other words, whoever has the power, whoever has the control gets to make all the rules. Now, in short, here's what that meant. That meant what was right today might change tomorrow. What's right today might change overnight. That's what it meant. So you never knew, because whoever had the power got to make all the rules. They believed this one was huge. They believed that the gods determine the fate of individuals. Now, let me tell you why this was such a big deal. This is why, with zero guilt and zero conscience problems, they could have a baby girl and the dad could say, I don't want that baby girl. We're going to go take her and leave her by the edge of the woods, leave her on the bank of the river, put her in the sewage ditch. No guilt, no concern. Because they believed, you know what, God's determine the fate of individuals. So if the gods want that baby to live, that girl to live, then somehow she'll live. If not, well, so be it. This is why men would kick women out and not worry about what happened. This is why nobody felt the need in the first century to come to the aid or the defense of women when they were raped, when they were abused, when they were misused. Nobody felt a need to come to the defense of children when they were mistreated, because it wasn't their problem. Well, the gods determine the fate of individuals. It's up to the gods. We'll just let it go. Now, you hear all of that and go, that's reprehensible. That's so wrong. Yeah, but what is clearly wrong to you and me today seemed perfectly right to them. You know why? Because these are the narratives, the stories, the explanations they had created to explain their world and to make sense of their circumstances. And so Paul comes along in the middle of this, and he did over and over again. But he comes along to the Corinthians and he goes, okay, now you're following Jesus, and you've got to let this go. Now you're following Jesus, and you've got to recognize that those things are all false, and they're destructive. And you need to instead create some narratives based on the truth of Jesus and what he taught. And so Paul, as he teaches them how to do this, he uses military language. It was very forceful, very powerful language. And the reason he did is because, one, it was very familiar to everybody in the first century, but also because Paul believed that our false narratives are so destructive and so damaging that we should use force, bring some power to conquer them, to get rid of them. As you're going to see in a minute, his terminology was to demolish them. So I want to take just a minute and read you what he said, and then we're going to get practical and talk about what this looks like for you and me. But here's how Paul said we should address, at least those of us who are Christians, these false narratives. He said, for though we live in the world, we don't wage war as the world does. He's not talking about a physical war. He's talking about a mental war, an emotional war, a spiritual war. Paul said, there's some stuff going on in your head and your heart, and you need to pay attention to it. You need to wage war against it. But if you're a follower of Jesus, this was Paul's perspective, if you're a follower of Jesus, there's a different way you wage that war than if you're not a follower of Jesus. You have some different tools at your disposal. He goes on, he says, the weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world. The weapons we fight with, and when he uses this term weapon, it's a Greek term that meant big artillery, big artillery. He's not talking about small stuff. He's going, no. People who don't follow Jesus, when they are battling stuff in their head and their heart, when they're trying to deal with emotions and beliefs and false narratives, they've only got so many tools at their disposal. You've got much bigger tools. You've got much bigger artillery. I cannot say that word today. I'm not going to say it again. You got big weapons. That's what he's saying. He's saying you got real big weapons. And what he's referring to here, and this would have been a visual for all of them, was in those days, whenever you went to lay siege to and attack a city, you would bring battering rams, you would bring catapults. He's talking about that kind of stuff. He says if you're following Jesus, you need to understand there is a way for you to deal with all those battles. You can win the battles in your head and in your heart. How? Well, here's what he tells us. On the contrary, the weapons we have divine power to demolish strongholds. In other words, if you're not a follower of Jesus, Paul's going, you've got these tools that you're trying to use to win this war, but they're really self-help tools, and they don't have enough power to help you win. They're self-help tools, and they can help you manage some things. They can't help you defeat them. But when you become a follower of Jesus, you now have tools with divine power. In other words, you have God's help. That's what you got. You have God's help to demolish strongholds. Now, when he said stronghold, we don't use that term anymore, but they had literal strongholds in the first century. They knew exactly what this looked like. These were military cities or military fortifications with big, thick, tall walls all around it that felt impenetrable. And so people would come, armies would come, and they would lay siege. But if you were inside of a stronghold, you could last a long time before anything happened to you. Now, the reason Paul brings this up and says we need to demolish strongholds, we think, I don't have any strongholds. And Paul goes, yeah, you do. You have built some walls in your life. You built some walls in your heart and your head to protect you from your own ignorance. Well, that's a little insulting, isn't it? Because you got some. And he begins to elaborate on what those are. He says, we demolish arguments. This is the first thing you've got to deal with. And the arguments that you have. What's an argument? Arguments are false narratives based on false assumptions. That's it. Paul says there's some things in you that you're still believing. There's some narratives, some stories, some explanations, and they're not true. But you believe they're true. You are certain they're true, and you have built walls up to protect these beliefs so nobody can challenge them. You're not going to let go of them. But they're hurting you. They're damaging you. You are treating people differently and living differently based on false narratives you believe, and he says you need to let God help you demolish those strongholds, tear down those walls, and replace those false narratives. He goes on, he says, we demolish strongholds and every pretension. There's a word we don't use much. Pretension just means this. It's arrogance and conceit. That's it. To which we all go, well, I'm not arrogant. I'm not conceited. But we are. We are in this sense. We are in the sense that there are certain things that we believe so deeply. We are, this is the word we use, certain. I am certain. Well, how are you certain? I'm just certain. Well, how are you certain? Well, I've just paid attention. Well, how are you certain? Well, that's just the way the world is. I'm just certain. And the reason you're certain, if you were honest, you're certain because from your seat, with your particular perspective and your experiences and the way you were raised and your worldview, this just makes total sense to you. You're certain that is true. Meanwhile, somebody else is on the other side, sitting in a different seat with different experiences and a different perspective, and they're going, no, I don't think that's true. But you won't look at it from anybody else's point of view. You won't even examine to see whether it really is true. You're certain. And that's pretension. That's arrogance. That's conceit. And we've all been guilty of it, haven't we? We all probably are guilty of it right now in some way. So Paul's point is this. If you're a follower of Jesus, now you should evaluate. You should examine all of the narratives that are bouncing around in your mind, all the stories and explanations you have for why things happen and why they do this and why God views you this way and why these circumstances took place and why God allowed. You should pay attention to all that because you might be carrying some false narratives, some arguments and pretension that you need to tear down because it's hurting you. It's damaging you. It's leading you to live life the wrong way. You say, well, how do I know what's false and what's true? Well, he tells us. He says, let's demolish all these arguments and pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Now, here was Paul's point here, if I can simplify this. Paul was basically saying, here's how you know which narratives are true and which ones are false. Do your narratives align with Jesus and what he taught? This is what he's saying. Do your narratives align with Jesus and the truth that he introduced to the world? Any narrative, story, explanation you have that aligns with what Jesus said is true, you can hold on to that. You can be certain. Anything that doesn't, you better pay attention to. If it doesn't line up with what God says is true, then you're carrying a false narrative. Now, just real quickly, and I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but if you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, that means for this to be true, then there has to be absolute truth. In other words, there has to be some standard of truth that's true for all people in all places and all times. Paul would say, yes, there is. And that has to become the anchor that shapes and defines all your narratives. Now, if you don't believe in absolute truth, and by that I just mean, if you think truth is different for different people based on the circumstances or situations they're in, if you think you have your truth, I have my truth, I'll carry mine, you carry yours, let's just all be good, that's fine. You can believe that, but here's what you have to recognize. If you don't believe there's absolute truth, then you cannot argue that anyone's truth is wrong. You just can't. So now everybody's truth is right. You say, no, there's some I don't think, by what standard? I'm just telling you. Either there's absolute truth or there's no truth. There's really nothing in the middle. So if you want to have your truth and I have my truth, that's fine, but you can't tell me mine's wrong. I can't tell you yours is wrong. Paul said, no, that doesn't even work. It doesn't even work because when you say there is no truth, that is an absolute statement of truth. So anyway, that doesn't work. You just got to hold on to your truth. And the only truth you can hold on to is the truth that Jesus introduced to the world. Another way to think about this is Paul is saying, take all your narratives and see if they line up with the vision and the values that Jesus came and introduced to us. This is why, by the way, it's so important for you to read your New Testament. You think, I'm just supposed to read the Bible to go. No. It's not just some habit or check something off a box. When you open up the scriptures and you begin to read them, you find all throughout the New Testament these truths of Jesus. You begin to discover what's true about you, what's true about the you beside you, what's true about God and how he views you. And suddenly, once you understand and see the truth, you can figure out which of your narratives line up with that and which ones might be off base that you have believed your entire life. And when you find a false narrative and you change it, it changes how you treat God, changes how you treat others, it changes how you treat yourself. So Paul says you should look at the knowledge. You got to have a standard of truth and then just compare everything that you believe and everything you say to that truth. And when you find something false, okay, well, what do I do with that, Paul? He says, here's all you have to do with it. Take it captive. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is it. Whenever you find a thought that doesn't align with what Jesus said, Paul's basic point is this. You don't have to let that thought rattle around in your head and determine what you do. You don't have to take it out for coffee and sit down and have a piece of pie and, maybe it is true and no. He says, when you see anything that's contradictory to what Jesus said, you grab that thought, you cuff it, and you throw it behind bars. In other words, you say, I'm not letting that thought control me anymore, to which we all go, but that feels true. I can't just do it, this thought, it feels true. And Paul would say, it doesn't matter how it feels, that's fine. It may feel true, but it's not true. So you replace the lie with the truth. And eventually what is true will start feeling true to you. But at first, you're just going to have to choose to do this. You're going to say, God, I need your help to tear down this stronghold, to tear down this lie, to get rid of this false narrative. God, I need your help to hold on to and believe what you say is true about me or the person next to me or your view of me. You take every thought captive, and then you just make it obedient, or you line it up with what Jesus says about you or what Jesus says to you. So that was Paul's advice to them. All these things that are false you need to change. Here's how you change it. You line it up. Anything that doesn't line up, you take it captive. You replace the lie with truth. So let me ask you a question. You got any strongholds that need to be demolished? You got any false narratives that you're living by? Let me help you. The answer is yes. It's yes for me too. We all do. You say, I don't think I've got any. No, that's because you assume all your narratives are true, okay? This is what makes it so hard. You got to actually pause and spend some time examining them to figure out what's true and what's not true. But I guarantee you've got some false ones, so do I. You say, I'm not sure I can figure out what you mean by that, Matt. Okay, here's what I'm going to do for the next couple minutes. I'm going to poke around a little bit, and I'm just warning you in advance, okay? This is the part where it'll get uncomfortable. I'm going to poke around a little bit, and I'm going to throw out a lot of different potential false narratives, okay? And most of them will not apply to you, but as I poke around a little bit, I bet I hit on something that causes you to get fired up a little bit, that causes you to argue with me in your head, that causes you to go, but it's different for me, that causes you to start justifying and condoning. Okay, the minute you feel any of that emotion rise up in you, you should hit pause and go, oh, there's the narrative I should pay attention to. And I don't know whether it's true or whether it's false. You've got to figure that out. But anytime there's emotion, whenever a narrative is challenged, you should pay attention, because what that tells you, something bumped up against your stronghold. Something bumped up against your wall. You have built walls to protect your narrative. If the narrative is true, you don't need any walls to protect it. It can handle scrutiny or attack from anyone or anything. If it's not true, you're going to build walls to protect it. So anytime you feel that tension, you should pause and pay attention. So, let me poke around a little bit. I'm not picking on you. This hits me just like it hits you. But this is how we start figuring this out. This is where it gets practical. So, what's your narrative behind why you won't talk to your dad about that thing? Why you won't call your mom? You've got the story and the explanation in your head, and you got the thing you tell everybody. But really, what is it? What's your narrative behind that? Is it true? Is it not true? What's your narrative behind why you drink so much? What's your narrative? What's the story you tell yourself when you get fired up when people mention to you, I think you may be drinking too much? Is it true or are you lying to yourself? What's your narrative behind how much debt you have? Because you've got a story, you've got an explanation. But is it true? Or have you bought into something that is going to continue to destroy and damage you and your life and your family and the people closest to you? Have you bought into a narrative that's just going to cause you to keep right on embracing that debt even though it's hurting you? What's your narrative behind why you want a divorce? Is it really why you want a divorce? What's your narrative behind why you got divorced? The thing that you've been telling yourself all these years, is that really true? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You should examine it though. Because don't you think if that's going to show up in the future, in future relationships? Of course it is. What's your narrative behind why you chose to move in with them? Because you had a story and you worked up a explanation that made sense to you, that convinced you should go ahead and do that. But is it true? You're being honest with yourself. What's your narrative behind why you decided to sleep with them? What's your narrative behind why you decided to flirt with them or get involved in that affair? Because you had a narrative, and the narrative actually convinced you that what you were doing was right. Now think about that for a minute. You wouldn't condone that behavior with anybody else, but you're condoning it with you, so you ought to at least examine that narrative and figure out what it's doing to you. What's your narrative behind why you won't take care of your health? The doctors told you need to, your family, your friends, they practically begged you to change. You won't change. What's the story? What's the explanation that you're telling yourself that makes it okay for you not to take care of yourself? Speaking of, what's the story? What's the narrative that you tell yourself that makes it okay for you to continue to let somebody treat you disrespectfully? What's the narrative of the story that you keep telling yourself that allows you the freedom to keep saying the things to yourself that you say to yourself? And treating yourself as if you have no worth and no value. Treating yourself as if you deserve everything that's happening to you. You should pay attention to that. You should figure out if that really is true or not. Because it's impacting you. It's impacting how you treat you. Here's another way to think of it. What do you tell yourself about? What do you tell yourself about why you're not more generous? Because you've come up with an explanation for why that is, so you can live with that without feeling the tension of you're not doing something that you say matters to you. So what story do you tell yourself about that? What's the story about why you don't follow through on certain things you commit to do? And you're notorious for it. And everybody knows it. And people mention it. But you've given yourself a story. You've come up with a narrative. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I don't know. But you've created a narrative that justifies that behavior. What's the story? What's the story behind why you keep changing jobs? I mean, there's a narrative you're telling yourself, but is it accurate? What's the story behind why that friendship is struggling so much? What are you telling yourself? What do you tell yourself about why you walked away from God? What do you tell yourself about why you walked away from church? What do you tell yourself about why you quit serving at church? What do you tell yourself about why you aren't going to give any time to exploring whether what Jesus taught really is true or not? You're just not going to give any time. You're just certain it's not true. You're certain. What are you telling yourself about that convinces you you're so certain? See, those are the narratives that are worth exploring. What do you tell yourself about why your marriage is struggling? What do you tell yourself about why your kid is struggling? What do you tell yourself about why no relationship seems to work out? What do you tell yourself about why you buy all the things you buy? See, when you start poking around, there are a lot of things that we tell ourselves. And then we build walls up to protect because we don't want anybody or anything coming in to challenge what we've told ourselves. We are certain it's true, and this is what we want to believe, and this is how we're going to live. But if that narrative is false, it is leading you to be your own worst enemy. And you have to decide if you're going to grab hold of and hold tightly to the narratives that align with what Jesus taught and address the ones that don't, or if you're going to keep building walls to protect your own ignorance and to protect your own preconceived notions and to protect your own pride and arrogance, and you just want to keep holding on to the false narratives. So here's what we're going to do as we close. I'm just going to be realistic. Realistically, this is something that none of us like to think about, and the reality is, if I just say, okay, let's pray and you're dismissed, you're going to walk out of here, and I'm the same way, you're going to get busy, you're going to forget about it, you're going to move on. So I thought, let's carve out 4 minutes, that's it, 4 minutes, for you to think, for you to reflect about what the narratives are that may be coming to your mind that you're starting to think, okay, maybe that's not true, but you don't even want to admit it. But just 4 minutes to reflect on it. And imagine what could be different if you took that narrative and you shifted it to what Jesus says is true about God, Jesus says is true about you, Jesus says is true about the you beside you. So I'm going to have Jen and Paul come up here and do a song. I don't want you to sing, I just want you to think. For some of you, you may want to pray. For some of you, you may want to admit to God, I think I've been holding on to this and it's not true. But reflect and own and acknowledge the story that you're telling yourself.